What do we know about beer in ancient Mesopotamia? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm talking to Dr. Tate Paulette, the author of In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia, for a conversation all about beer in ancient Mesopotamia. What do we know about it archaeologically? When did they start to make it? How did they make it? Do we know what it tasted like? Why did they drink it? Do we know anything about the role of beer in society? How much of society is indebted to beer? We're going to talk about all of this and more in this interview. The book is a great read. If you're interested in more, I highly recommend it. Remember, for early access to ad-free video versions of our podcast and exclusive bonus content, you can come join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about a history of beer in ancient Mesopotamia. Dr. Tate Paulette, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk today about your new book, In the Land of Ninkasi, and a topic that I think will have a lot of people's interest, the history of beer and the history of beer in ancient Mesopotamia. I'm personally very fascinated, so thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Can you give a little backstory? Because I know you do in your book, but for someone who hasn't read the book yet and is coming to it for the first time, how did you come to the study of beer? Because this feels like such an interesting topic, but maybe one that is a surprise to some people, that like this is the academic thing that you got to pick. How did you end up there?
Yeah, I kind of fell into the study of beer in kind of like the opposite way that from what you might expect. It was actually via an experimental brewing project that I got involved in while I was a graduate student in Chicago at the University of Chicago. I was studying Mesopotamian archaeology, and another graduate student and I, Mike Fisher, who was also studying Mesopotamian archaeology, we both also happened to like beer. And we were about midway through our studies, and we had said, wait a minute, why are we not working on beer in Mesopotamia? This was a fundamental thing for them. We love it. Why are we not working on this? So we had just started doing that. I think we had given maybe one conference paper about the topic. And then one evening we were at a bar in Chicago chatting, and Mike said, hey, I just heard that there's going to be an experimental brewing collaboration that the owner of Great Lakes Brewing Company, Pat Conway, who was a University of Chicago graduate, had come to the Oriental Institute where we were studying. It's now no longer called that. It's now ISAC, the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. He had come saying he wanted to do some kind of collaboration on some kind of ancient beverage. And they had hit on Mesopotamian beer, and they were basically looking for volunteers who wanted to work on this project. And so we said, yes, us. And so that's how I got involved in it, basically. And it's kind of interesting to me because this is a part of what you'd call experimental archaeology. So a big field now.
Yeah, can you say a little bit about like the experimental beer and experimental archaeology, how that, aligns for people that are thinking maybe, I hear that and I think, well, I know archaeology as digging, and you're talking about this as being related to brewing. So like, what's that overlap look like?
Yeah, I don't know exactly when this really got going. I want to say maybe the 1970s or something. There was a real push to start what we call experimental archaeology, which is basically you have some kind of questions about the past, something that you're struggling to understand, maybe about the artifacts that you're finding or something. And in order to better understand them, actually putting into practice whatever it is that you were trying to study in the past. So if you're studying pottery, you might be actually making some pottery or breaking some pottery. Or if you are interested in how animals were butchered, you might actually try butchering some animals now with flints and things like that. And so it became a way of especially trying to answer questions that we had about the past that were difficult to answer otherwise. So you have like a certain kind of artifact that has some kind of use wear on it, and you're not quite sure what might have caused that wear on the edge of the artifact. And so you tried doing different things with a replica artifact today to see what kind of wear is produced. So trying to answer questions about that kind of thing. And so it's now very much a normal part of archaeology for many people. I think it's widely accepted as a method that we can use for trying to answer questions about the past. And so I situate the kind of work we were doing partly in the sort of experimental side of things and also kind of the experiential side, which I can get to more if we want to talk about that. But I guess one of the things that I like to highlight about our project, which maybe contrasts a little with what I just said, is that because we came at things from kind of like the opposite direction, it's not like we spent years and years researching the topic and came up with questions that we wanted answered, and then we did some experiments to answer those questions. We were coming at it by doing the experiments first, And so what I really like to emphasize is how valuable experimental archaeology is for generating questions, not just answers, because that's my real takeaway from this project is all the questions that were generated by this. And so, I fell into this topic by basically being thrown into an experimental brewing project where the brewer said, okay, how do we brew this beer? And so those of us it was a whole team effort, maybe 8 or 10 brewers over the years, maybe 8 or 10 people on our side who were archaeologists, Assyriologists, et cetera. And so our team had to huddle and say, okay, how do we think they brewed beer? And we sort of we put together maybe a page and a half description of here's how we think they might have brewed beer in Mesopotamia. We gave it to the brewers, and they not long after sent us a list of maybe 30 questions. And these were questions where you read each one and you're like, oh boy, it would take years of research to answer just that one question. There's so many uncertainties involved here. And so we came up with the best answers we could, sent it back to them. They sent us more questions. So that was the sort of early days of this. It was a very interesting way to throw oneself into the topic.
And when they come to you and ask, here's the request for that 1 page or page and a half description of how we think they did this, did you have like a clear source text you could turn to say, we happen to have, a recipe or recipes? Or how did you come to creating that description for them before they come back with, questions 1 through 30 of, could you provide some more clarification?
Yeah, the answer is kind of yes and no. There is one famous text called the Hymn to Ninkasi. So this is a hymn to the beer goddess, Ninkasi. It's sort of a song written in her honor. And this is what you will mostly hear about. If anyone says there's a recipe for brewing beer in Mesopotamia, that's probably what they mean. But it is definitely not a recipe for brewing beer.
Okay.
I spend a lot of time in the book actually trying to kind of complicate this and say, this is some kind of song, maybe even like a drinking song. How much information can we really pull out of this about how they exactly brewed their beer? But the reason that it has gotten so much attention is because basically in order to praise Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, it gives us a series of little images of her at work in the brewery doing the typical things that a brewer does. Mm-hmm. Because Ninkasi is, whenever they talk about her, above all, she's a goddess of beer, but she's a brewer. And so here we see her going through different steps in the brewing process. And it seems like they might be sort of arranged in a step-by-step fashion. And so that's why it's generated so much attention. But it's a song. It's not instructions. It's a kind of these evocative little images of Ninkasi at work. So it's not at all, you can't just take it and brew beer without adding.
Yeah, you can't just take that in hand and say, I'm going to follow your directions exactly and end up with that drink.
And I should say that I feel like I have regularly gotten the question, well, is that the only text that we have about beer in Mesopotamia? And that is definitely not the case. Thousands and thousands of cuneiform documents tell us about beer in some way or another. And many of those do hit on the production process in one way or another, but often not in a very straightforward way. There are some other texts that some people have called recipes. They're also not really recipes. They're the most discussed ones come from this city called Girsu during what's called the early dynastic period. And these are basically accounting documents for a temple. And they're documenting the delivery of brewing ingredients. And in some cases, they're telling us exactly what quantity of which ingredients were used to brew specific volumes of specific kinds of beer. So they had a golden beer, they had a dark beer, a sweet dark beer, a reddish brown beer, and a strained or filtered beer. And so we get something like what we would now call the grain bill for particular beers. That is the different grain products in particular that went into those beers. And what's really nice is that you don't just get quantities of those, but you get the volume of beer, which is really means that you can, in some sense, potentially use them to understand what that beer might have been like.
But also presents this like that number of different types of beer. In thinking through, I feel like the imagination might be, well, they have one, you're making something, and it's going to be a simple version versus, if you walk into a brewery today and there might be 30 taps lined up and here's all the varieties. But that variety or the desire for variety isn't a new thing. That goes all the way back to these ancient kind of recipes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, those are some pretty early ones. Even at the earliest cuneiform, almost the earliest cuneiform documents that we have, a lot of them were about beer, and some of them are similarly telling us about the ingredients used to brew particular types of beer, even though it's kind of hard to understand. They're much more difficult to translate exactly in those earliest ones. But yeah, from as soon as they were writing about beer, about 3000 BC, there were different types. And I mean, and as you move through time, we're talking about something like 3,000 years of history that I'm covering in my book. And those types that they recognize change over time. And I don't think we could ever argue that we know the full range of beers that they were consuming at any one time, because we get these particular archives of texts that we're working with from particular places. But I guess a bigger thing that I always like to emphasize touches on one of your points there. What people do often say to me, well, these were probably just really simple beers, very basic, and they were probably kind of gross. And my response is always, well, we don't actually know a whole lot about the prehistory of beer right now in Mesopotamia, about what happened before that sort of 3000 BC period. But almost certainly beer had been produced and consumed for thousands of years before that. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that by this point, they already have a very sophisticated beer culture. And we have to imagine all different types of beer, from the simple and cheaply made to the very fancy, even if we can't always see them perfectly in our evidence.
When you're talking about the prehistory here, there's always the desire for an origin point. Like we like to have a starting point where this thing kind of emerged onto the scene. In not having the prehistory, do we have an archaeological origin point where maybe we don't know when that started, but we can see something when this starts to show up either in the texts or in, the production record starts to show up that aligns with that? Is there a period of time we can start to see that emerge, or is it similarly murky and maybe it's appearing in different places at different times in a way that's not so easily defined?
Yeah, probably the latter. I mean, so certainly as soon as we go before this period, so 3000 BC in Mesopotamia, this is the first written texts in world history. So before that, we don't have written material to work with anywhere. Maybe in the few centuries before that. So we are definitely in the realm of archaeological evidence. Mm-hmm. And there has been this is a very dynamic field, especially if you're talking globally, trying to find the earliest evidence for different kinds of alcoholic beverages. And so there is actually quite a lot of work being done, especially because over the past few decades, new scientific methods became available that allowed us to really analyze residues left behind in vessels of different kinds.
Right.
And so there's been a lot of work. It mainly comes down to an ability to say, yes, there was a beverage made, an alcoholic beverage of this sort, either being made or consumed using this particular vessel. And we can get some idea of maybe some of the key ingredients. For example, some of this work has been showing that a lot of the earliest beverages were kind of like hybrids. They were possibly throwing in a bunch of different fermentable things like grains and fruits and honey and things like that. So we are getting a lot of information about that. I think we're still in the early days of it, but basically the dates for beer in particular have been pushed back to about 10,000 BC-ish, maybe slightly earlier than that. And that is in basically the region that I'm talking about. There's also been a lot of work in East Asia lately, pushing the dates for different beverages back very early. And that's both sort of rice beers, what we now would call rice wines, I guess, but rice beers, but also these hybrids. And I guess in those earliest ones, they are also hybrids. It takes a while before they have evidence for just straight up beers. So let's see. So in the region we're talking about, we only have just a couple of examples of very early potential evidence for beer from that sort of 10,000 BC range and maybe a few thousand years around that. And then there's kind of a big break before we get to the period that I'm really focusing on, where suddenly we just have a wealth of evidence available to us.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how I try to present it in the book. I call it the world's first great beer culture, because I'm not saying this is the earliest beer anywhere. I'm saying this is our first chance, because of all the evidence that's available, to really paint a full picture of the beer culture at the time.
Yeah, could we talk about the beer culture part? Because I really liked this part of your book and going through the different, cultural connections, but also all of the things that circle around this. Because as you mentioned before, right, there can be that assumption that, oh, this is just something unpleasant, a sludge that's tolerated for whatever reason, and we move along. But as you discussed, there are so many varieties, and there's all of these cultural connections that develop around beer. So if you're coming to someone for the first time to try to introduce them to ancient Mesopotamian beer culture, is there something that the modern person engaged in an American beer culture would recognize in that ancient Mesopotamian beer culture? Are there parallels, or is it a world unto itself?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely parallels. I think there are many things. I try to emphasize this. There are both these points where you can feel a real connection between our sort of beer cultures and theirs, and others where it might seem stranger to us. I guess maybe one big point of connection is they had taverns in the same way that we have bars and pubs and things. They had what essentially like neighborhood taverns that were owned by private individuals and owned and run by private individuals, and were almost certainly, in most cases, making the beer right there on premises, and selling it. And so I think, now, what were those taverns like? Would that have been familiar to us? I mean, that's harder. Some elements probably. I mean, when I think about one of the biggest differences, if you were going to say, well, here's some similarity, but a difference, is that at least, especially when they like to depict beer consumption in the artistic record, they like to show people drinking beer through long straws from a communal vessel.
Right.
And we don't necessarily know if that's what was happening in taverns. Taverns are in this kind of murky territory where they were not run by the big institutions like the palaces and temples. And that's who was producing most of the written documentation. And so taverns only appear kind of where they intersect with institutional interests, and sometimes in literature pretty regularly and things like that. So we don't have a detailed picture of them. And from some of the archaeological examples that we have, it seems like they probably were drinking out of cups, at least sometimes. But artistically, they loved to show the drinking of what was probably beer through straws. So that's a sort of big difference.
When we're talking about, I guess, similarities and differences here too, the people drinking the beer through a straw or not, was this fair game for everyone? Was there an age requirement? Was this a gendered activity? Do we know anything about that side of, beer consumption or tavern life?
Yeah, it's kind of a huge question that I'd say we know partly, and there's other things that we don't know yet. So on the one hand, we can definitely say that people all across the social spectrum were drinking beer. We have, for example, some documents that are about prisoners of war, especially women and children, who were being given rations of beer as sort of daily subsistence. We have construction workers who were being given beer while they were at work on the job. But then we also have kings drinking beer on all sorts of special occasions, and They were the deities who were really the ones in charge. Each city had its sort of patron deity who was described in an anthropomorphic sort of way. And those deities were literally fed with beer and other food on a daily basis. So you have beer consumption definitely spanning the social spectrum. The question of gender is a big one, and I don't think that we almost certainly we can expect there to have been shifts in all of these things over this 3,000 year period. And that's something that I don't think we yet have a really good handle on. I think it's something kind of for the future, is to really get a sense for change over time and some of these kind of angles that you're highlighting. I think what we can say for certain is that it was not strange for them to depict in the artistic record, for example, men and women drinking alongside one another. So there doesn't seem to have been some sort of strict division at that level. We have one of the best bodies of artistic evidence is what we often call banquet scenes. They especially date to the early dynastic period and the Akkadian period, which is during the 3rd millennium BC. And they're all showing what I think are probably kind of elite banquets. You see people sort of sitting up in a sort of prim and proper way on fancy chairs, and they're either drinking from little cups held in their hand, or they are sharing beer from a communal vessel through straws. And then you'll have people standing next to them as kind of servers. You also have entertainment, sometimes people playing music, dancing. And so there are hundreds of these scenes from a relatively restricted period of time, over a few hundred years, I guess. And for some people have gone through them and just sort of counted up. How many of these scenes show only men? How many show only women? How many show both? And you get quite a lot of each of those. So that there are certainly other ways to think about gender, but I don't think that we yet, and that's on the consumption side. I mean, the production side is something that people are often very interested in, especially what was the role of women in brewing. And it's another one where we both have plenty of interesting evidence, but I also don't think we yet can tell a real story over time. I think there have been suggestions like, do we see something similar in the realm of brewing to what you have maybe in early England, where you have a sort of household brewing, which then where you have women especially doing the brewing, and then certain households start to serve it to a broader group of people, and so you get this sort of transition into something more like pubs, or like taverns. And where you still have women doing the brewing. And then you have a gradual evolution to larger scale breweries where you can watch basically men co-opting the position of brewer. And I'm not, I don't know that particular story in detail, but there's a desire sometimes to see something similar in Mesopotamia. I don't think we can yet tell that story exactly, but what we do have is where we see home brewing, which is, it's hard to identify, but when we see it in the written record, it seems to be women doing it. When we have taverns, we have both male and female tavern keepers, but they appear in sort of different places in the written record. And when taverns appear in literature, which we have a lot of great literature from Mesopotamia, tavern keepers seem to be women. So it seems like it was quintessentially a women's occupation. But when you see, I think that there are terms for both male and female brewers at the bigger level, at the sort of institutional brewing level, but those are mainly men serving as brewers. So you can see why there's hints of that potential sort of transition, but I don't think that we can really document it exactly yet. What was the last thing you said? Age. Age.
Yeah, age. I mean, because you talked about here workers. Do we have and you mentioned children too. So like children are participating in some way in the consumption of the beer as well?
Yeah, at least in some bits of evidence. It definitely is not like all like huge amounts of evidence for children drinking lots of alcohol or something like that. But I mentioned those texts that are basically ration documents for these prisoners of war, which includes children. And I mean, children in general are kind of an understudied topic, I think. So I would say the way that I usually end up talking about it in the book, as you've seen at least a few times, is that um, another group that has tried to replicate these Mesopotamian beers based on their excavations at this place called Tel Bazi in Syria. When they brewed the beer, they came up with a theory about a different kind of brewing process. They called it cold mashing, which is kind of counterintuitive, I think, to many of us when we think about brewing. They basically were arguing that there was no heat used in the brewing process. And when they made their own beer using this method, it was a very low alcohol beer. So something like 0.5 to 1.5% alcohol. And that was kind of taken up by some academics, some people in the press. Mesopotamian beer didn't have any alcohol in it. It was barely even beer at all. But if you read their publications, there's a sentence or two in each one that says, well, because we know that children sometimes drank beer in Mesopotamia, it must have been a low alcohol beer. So we used a malt to water ratio that would produce a low alcohol beer. So it could be the case, but their experiments didn't demonstrate that the beers were low alcohol. And definitely the underlying assumption that if children drank it, it must have been low in alcohol, I think does not stand up to cross-cultural comparison.
Yeah, they could have been participating in alcoholic beer, because you mentioned literature, because I think, if people are coming to was it alcoholic? Were they getting drunk on this or not? You mentioned literature here a little bit, and you discussed it in your book, this connection with Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a potential way into some consideration, not for every type of beer, but is there an alcoholic or a drunkenness that can be associated? Could you say a little bit about that role? Because you also draw on some interesting connections between that and the role of, whether you want to call it society or societal developments or civilization, that beer plays a role with in that story as that bridge between, just the archaeological record and some of this literature that you've discussed as well.
Yeah, so you're talking about this kind of famous scene from the Epic of Gilgamesh where we have this wild man Enkidu who's being sent in to basically do battle with Gilgamesh, and he has to be kind of civilized as part of that process, because he's going to the big city to meet this king. And as part of the process from transforming him from this wild animal basically to a human being, he has to learn how to drink beer and eat bread. He has to wear clothes. And so you have this really pivotal moment in what was a really important story to them. We know the Epic of Gilgamesh as this famous piece of literature now, but it's not just us who feel that way. For them, it was a fundamental piece of literature, a story that everyone knew. And so right at the heart of that, you have Enkidu learning how to drink beer, and he drinks 7 goblets. And then it describes him feeling this kind of like lightness and elation. He starts to sing. And so it definitely doesn't describe him being drunk. And this is, I think, maybe the case with many descriptions of alcohol consumption in literature, is that there's a lot of this kind of like happiness and feeling good in your body and that sort of thing. So maybe a sort of like tipsiness. It's more only occasionally where you have a more drunkenness appearing. Like I spend some time writing about this great tale about the god Enki and the goddess Inanna, where you have Inanna gets all dressed up in a super fancy way to go visit him, and it seems like she actually goes there for a purpose. So he has all of these special powers under his control called the May, which we often translate as like the arts of civilization or something. It's like all the things that were most important to them, all the key things for civilization. He had these powers that were under his control. She gets all dressed up and she comes to visit him, and he lays out a feast. Basically, they sit down, they start eating and drinking together, and then there's kind of like a break in the text. And when the text picks up again, what we see is Enki basically giving his powers to her, one after the other, and then we basically see him in another fragment. There's a break again, and then we see him waking up, and it says, "As the beer cleared from Father Enki, who had drunk beer," and you get him sort of waking up from his drunkenness and saying, "Where's all my stuff?" And he has this minister who's been standing there behind him watching the whole thing. And he says, "Well, you gave them all to Inanna." And then he starts listing off all these things so we get these little hints. That seems like a little more on the sort of drunken side.
Yeah. A little bit of forgetfulness and indiscretion in your actions, and some things that people might say, I feel like I hear some actions or some parallels between these types of things in both of these stories. And I guess this ties back to that banqueting scene depiction as well. There are these connections or possible connotations between beer and sex as well in these stories or in these scenes. And you talked about some of these banqueting scenes images, but you discuss in your book some of these other images that we'll see as far as the culture that might be associated or activities that might be associated with beer in the iconographic record. Could you say a little bit about those as well?
Yes, sure. And I actually opened the book, with us, my wife and I in Syria at the site of Hamukar, and in the course of her excavations for her dissertation, one of our friends, Salam Al-Kuntar, I opened the book with her excavating a cylinder seal that has one of these images that you're talking about on it. So like a cylinder seal, in case people don't know, it's these little cylindrical carved stones that would have had detailed imagery carved around the edges. And they served kind of like a signature for people. You would take it and you would roll it in wet clay, and it would leave behind an image of what was carved into it. And this one that Salam excavated in this burial had been on a necklace. So someone had it on their necklace. And after it was excavated and we took it out and rolled it out in clay so that we could actually see what was inscribed on there, it had one of these scenes, which is basically a drinking beer during sex scene. And so this is actually, and it's not nearly as common as those banquet scenes, but it's relatively common. This is a pretty early example of it. Most of them seem to date to just after 2000 BC. And this one was maybe 2400 BC, something like that. And what you have in at least most of these is a jar on the ground with a straw coming up out of it. And you have a woman who's bent over drinking through that straw. And then you have a man behind her. And so there's these like sex scenes with drinking. Yes. And this connection between sex and beer goes in other directions. Certainly the tavern was associated with sex. There's lots of debates about the terms that we've often translated as prostitute. But whatever exactly those figures are where that term is referring to, they are often associated with tavern life. We also have some great love poems in Sumerian. That's one of the two main languages in this region. And they regularly reference beer, often as a kind of like metaphorical way of talking about your beloved. So yeah, there's definitely a connection.
With all of these different like avenues that you touch on in the book and that you're discussing today, are there problems that you feel like people often run into when they start to think about beer and then trying to understand the role that beer played? Like it feels like it overlaps with so many things in ways that maybe it's not completely dissimilar to today, but is connected to palaces and to temples and to taverns and to sex and to literature. Like how central was beer to the daily life of someone in ancient Mesopotamia?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was pretty central, probably. I mean, this is one of those cases where we can't say, yes, definitely. We know how this impacted everyone. I mean, I will say that I think we probably underestimate the role that beer and other things like it play in our own society. So it is certainly the case that it played a different role for them. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of everywhere. It was almost like the definition of drink. It's like beer and bread, food and drink and food, and it's all over the place. And you definitely, when coming at this, I mean, this applies to those sex scenes that we're just talking about. I mean, we certainly need to do our best to kind of put aside our own kind of cultural conditioning when we approach these things. We certainly can't assume that for them, this image of a woman drinking beer during sex meant something like it would to us. And I mean, that's a very difficult sort of question. We don't know exactly what these scenes were for them. And
Right.
so those kind of things, I mean, certainly the question that we talked about earlier of children drinking alcohol, many people certainly have strong feelings about that now. I don't think there is evidence that they had those strong feelings. It doesn't mean that some people didn't, but so yeah, there's a lot of those kind of assumptions that I feel like we need to do our best to kind of put aside. I mean, also, I do spend some time just saying we need to also broaden our consumption of what beer is, or beer was.
Right.
Definitely, they were not drinking something like very similar to what many of us are most familiar with as beer, what we get, in bottles at the store or something. I think one way that I try to sort of broaden our minds about this in the book is I bring in this case study from Burkina Faso in modern day Africa, because I try to be very clear about this. I don't bring it in because I want to say ancient Mesopotamian, that this ancient brewing tradition has survived in this one place. It's like a remnant of the past. I bring it in because you have a really strong brewing tradition in many parts of Africa that has a deep pedigree, and it's very different from the kind of Euro-American brewing tradition and where it's gone. And so I bring this in as a sort of point of comparison. And I think it's possible that Mesopotamian beer might have been a little bit more like some of the millet and sorghum beers that are still being brewed in sort of using traditional practices in Africa. And so I think that's a big one. I mean, it is true that beer in Mesopotamia was brewed using malted barley, which is also the fundamental ingredient in many of our own beers. But when you're stepping back to look at the global history of beer, I really want people to not look at that as just a history of barley beer. There were different grains that became important in different regions. Like I mentioned, rice beers in East Asia, or corn, maize in Central and South America. And just there's all different, I mentioned millet and sorghum. And so there's a much more interesting and much more diverse history to beer than what we tend to talk about. And I often run into people talking about why is Mesopotamia interesting? Because it's the origin of beer. And I really try to avoid saying that, because I don't think that that's accurate. It's not that it's impossible that beer originated in that region and did spread out in different ways. Certainly, that could be the case. I don't think that we are currently able to make that argument. But it is the case that plants and animals were domesticated in this region. They were also domesticated in various other parts of the world, different plants, different animals. But in this region, that package of domesticates did spread westwards into Europe. And it's possible that the brewing of beer was developed very early on and sort of moved along with, domesticated grains. But I don't think that we have the evidence yet to make that argument. Maybe we will be able to at some point here.
That's one of those areas.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, one of those areas for people who are interested in future research. It sounds like there are many avenues to still be pursued, expanding avenues, whether it's archaeologically or in experimental archaeology as well within this space of beer. For those that are looking for kind of those next steps, did you come across more questions? Because inevitably, I'm sure you did, just like when you were doing the experimental brewing and they came back with that list. Was there a question that surprised you as you were working through this book that has, started a new project, or is one of those things that you're waiting for someone else to come up with the answer for so that, you don't have to do it and they can provide you the answer?
There's so many questions. I kind of hope that my book functions in that way, to just sort of say, okay, here's what we know about this topic. And there's so much that we still don't know. So I hope some people might pick up some of those questions. I guess at the sort of largest scale, I already mentioned these issues of kind of change over time. I really think that there should be more attention to that kind of thing. And also spatial variation. This is a big region. and we're talking about a huge length of time, we should be able to see all kinds of diversity in there. I mean, we should also expect people who were brewing in their home to be brewing a very different sort of beer than was being brewed in the palaces and temples, potentially.
Right.
These big picture questions are wide open. I mean, another one that I just happen to be really interested in is, I'm an archaeologist, so we often think in a spatial fashion. And what I want to be able to see is, what did both the brewing landscape and the beer consumption landscape look like in a city? We can go, when we look at sort of the history of brewing and drinking in European cities or even American cities, we can, to some degree, we could create a map of taverns or breweries and think about, we just don't have that at all for Mesopotamia. And I really would love to know that. I would love to be able to say, in the city of Ur, in this period, where were all the different taverns, and how did they work on a neighborhood level and things like that? Did they have different characters, these different places? When it comes to more specific questions, I will say over and over throughout writing it, what I wanted to say was, I wish someone would just write a dissertation about this topic. I said this to somebody the other day, but a big one would be bapir. This is one of the key brewing ingredients. That's the Sumerian word for it. And we just don't know exactly what it was. There's been a lot of discussion and there are good ideas, but we need somebody to go through, compile all of the evidence and give us a really thorough discussion of it. I mean, there's so many. One of the other big questions when talking about how did these beers compare to our own beers is the consensus is definitely that they didn't have hops. And so for us, in the sort of Euro-American beer tradition, hops are really the fundamental flavoring ingredient. There's other things used, but they weren't using that. And so what were they using? It is extremely frustrating how little we know about that. There's a sort of a general word that's often translated as aromatics. But when it comes to specific ones, we know that they had a lot of different things available to them, all kinds of herbs and spices and vegetables and fruits and things. We know that they sometimes use date syrup in their beers. And especially during the later part of the story I'm telling, there was this ingredient called kasu in Akkadian, the other main language in Mesopotamia. But we don't know what it was exactly. There have been, 8 or 10 different translations offered for that word. And it's been a very, very detailed discussion, but we still don't really know. And so when trying to talk about what these beers might have tasted like, it's very difficult if we don't even know. It's not only that we don't know exactly which flavoring ingredients they were using. Some people have even suggested that they weren't really using any. And that would that would be a big difference. So there's some questions.
So there's a laundry list of questions. If someone is listening along and saying, I would love, if you're looking for a dissertation topic, well, there's a couple that you could pursue, but there's plenty of things to still be done in this space. And the book, I do really love the book. We were talking about this before. It's written in such a way that if you're listening to this and you're like, I would love more, but I don't know. No, you should go and get this book. It is both, right? You're going to get the technical stuff, but it's written in such a way that it's very approachable and accessible as you move your way through. I really enjoyed working through your book. I agree that there's so much more. I would love 5 more of these. So, whether that comes from you or someone else, I'd happy to hear whatever we have coming down the pipe. But Dr. Tate Paulette, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us today about your book and about the history of beer in ancient Mesopotamia. I really enjoyed it. Is there anything that people need to know, the last question that they should have in their mind, whether when they're going to the fridge, maybe later to grab their beer for themselves, or when they're going to the book, the thing you want to stick in their mind as they go?
Oh, good question. I guess, so I'm often asked, well, what if I wanted to try a beer today that would be most similar to one of these beers? It's a very difficult question. I've just said there might be some analogs. I think the easiest way to at least get a little bit closer is if you've never tried a beer that's a little more on the sour or tart side, would be to try something like that. There's lots of examples from sort of classic Belgian ones, but also just all kinds of things being made today, because almost certainly these beers were not just being fermented with yeast. There were also various kind of bacteria involved. They almost certainly would have had that kind of a sourness to them. And I mean, if you really want to be authentic about it, it probably shouldn't have been very carbonated. We don't really know that, but maybe you need to pour it and let it sit for a while and get flat.
Get flat and get out your straw potentially.
Yes, definitely a straw. I mean, yeah, you gotta do that.
That's a very different experience there. I can't say I've ever had beer through a straw. It just feels odd.
When we did our first tasting event for these experimental beers back in Cleveland, quite a few years ago now, we kind of at the last minute, we had this idea. We were like, well, okay, we're going to serve people these beers in nice little tasting glasses, because what we would always serve them at least one of the beers that we made using as authentically as we could, and then we would serve them another beer that was basically the same ingredients but modern brewing equipment, so they could see them and taste them side by side. At the last minute, we said, well, let's also give them the option of trying it through a straw, but also from one of those big communal vessels. And so we got one of our replica vessels that we'd been using to brew, and we put it up at the front and put beer in it. And we got these big, long, fluorescent plastic straws that we put in there. And we figured maybe a few people would try it. But I mean, at the end, we said, okay, if anybody wants to come try it from straws, and everyone flooded up to the front. So that was fun. Yeah, it was a totally different sort of drinking experience.
Yeah, so I guess that's the homework assignment for someone that's looking to join into the experimental archaeology side, is to get yourself a vessel that's a replica and your straw, let your beer sit for a while, make it a sour, and then see how that gets us as close as we might be able to from the comfort of your own home.
Yes, and the other thing would be, there are also plenty of beers available now that don't use hops. And so often people are remaking these beers called Groots, and others, like there's a number of breweries here in North Carolina that are really experimental, using all kinds of foraged ingredients and things, and often not using hops or using very few. So that would also be another way to get a little closer, would be to find something like that.
Well, Dr. Tate Paulette, thank you so much. Well, for the homework, this sounds like enjoyable homework for anyone who's interested. So thank you. It's summer, but the homework keeps coming. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I loved the book. Again, the link is down in the description. In the Land of Ninkasi, A History of Beer in Ancient Mesopotamia. It's definitely worth the read. Dr. Tate Paulette, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for everyone who's tuning in. Like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.